There you go. So, our next speaker, we're coming back to a cancer theme again with two talks on cancer phylogeny. And our first in that series is Nuraini Aguse.
Hello everyone, my name is Nuraini Aguse. I'm from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and today I'm going to talk about summarizing the solution space in tumor phylogeny inference by multiple consensus trees. So here's the outline of my presentation today. I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction to tumor phylogenies, then I'm going to go into previous work before going into the multiple consensus trees problem. So we've heard in the past few days about tumor phylogenies. So cancer results from an evolutionary process. It starts with a normal cell. That cell acquires a cancerous mutation. Then that cell undergoes clonal expansion, and some additional cells acquire additional mutations, and those individual cells divide and duplicate. And finally, we have a heterogeneous tumor consisting of clones of different sets of mutations. So this tumor progression can be represented as a phylogenetic tree. Down here is an example of a phylogenetic tree, and in this field of tumor phylogenetics, it is common to employ this infinite sites assumption, which states that a mutation is gained only once and is never subsequently lost. Under this mutation, and under this assumption, we can also represent the phylogenetic tree as a mutation tree, seen here on the right. And in the subsequent slides, I will use the mutation tree representation in place of the phylogenetic tree representation. So why are we interested in knowing the tumor phylogenies? Turns out phylogenies enables us to understand and treat cancer. So it helps us identify targets for treatment, understand metastatic development, and recognize common patterns of tumor evolution across patients. So given this importance, how do we then obtain the phylogenetic tree of a tumor? Currently, tumor phylogeny inference are obtained from bulk sequencing data or single-cell sequencing data. In bulk sequencing data, it provides us with frequencies of mutations as variant allele frequencies, whereas single-cell sequencing currently has high false positive and false negative rate. So both of these factors contribute to the non-uniqueness of tumor phylogeny inference, meaning that from a sequencing data, we obtain a solution space of possible phylogenetic trees instead of a single phylogenetic tree. So I mentioned in the previous slide that tumor phylogeny inference is important for understanding and treating cancer. And these downstream analyses critically rely on accurate phylogeny inference. So we need to be able to summarize this solution space of possible phylogenetic trees in order to reduce inference errors and identify dependencies among mutations. Now the question becomes, how do we best summarize the solution space? So let's look into some previous work done in summarizing the solution space of tumor phylogeny inference. In our paper, we use this data from a New England Journal of Medicine article. And in this paper, there's a cohort of 100 lung cancer patients. Out of these 100 patients, 25 of them have more than one tumor phylogeny inferred for their data. And in particular, to illustrate the previous summary methods, let's look at this specific patient, patient 37, which has 17 trees inferred. So the first summary method is called parent-child graph. This is the parent-child graph of the solution space for patient 37. It's simply the union of all of the edges in the trees in the solution space, and the number on the edges correspond to how many trees in the solution space that have that edge. And if we do some analysis on this parent-child graph, and we count how many edges or combination of edges that occur in the solution space, specifically, let's look at the combination of edges V1, V7, and V4, V10. We find that there are no trees in the solution space which have this combination of edges. However, it's represented here in the parent-child graph. Therefore, patterns of mutual exclusivity are not captured in parent-child graph. Next, let's look at a single consensus tree. This is actually the same parent-child graph. In addition, the highlighted edges correspond to the single consensus tree solution to the patient 37 solution space. And if we do a similar analysis, this time let's look at edges V4, V7, and V1, V10. There are only 2 trees, 2 out of the 17 trees in the solution space that have this combination of edges. However, it's being chosen here as the substructure of this single consensus tree. Therefore, a single consensus tree results in inaccurate summary of diverse solution spaces like this one. To address these limitations, we now turn to the multiple consensus trees problem. So in the multiple consensus trees problem, we simultaneously cluster and infer the consensus tree. This is an example, a solution to the patient 37 solution space. We have 2 trees, and I'll get to the significance of these 2 trees and why we need 2 consensus trees at the end of my presentation. But first, let's look at the combinatorial characterizations of solutions to MCT. We need to first look at the single consensus tree problem, which states that given a solution space of phylogenetic trees, we want to find a consensus tree R such that the distance between each tree in the solution space and R is minimum. If we look at the distance function, so the distance between 2 trees is simply the size of the symmetric difference of the edge set of those 2 trees, and this is what's called the parent-child distance. So there's a theorem that states that a maximum weight spanning arborescence of a parent-child graph is a solution to the SCT problem. And to illustrate that, let's look at the solution space here with 6 phylogenetic trees. On the right, you'll see the parent-child graph of the solution space where the orange edges correspond to the single consensus tree of the solution space. Now, let's look at the multiple consensus trees problem, which states that given a solution space of phylogenetic trees and k greater than 0, we want to find the surjective clustering sigma and consensus trees are such that the sum of the distances between each tree in the solution space and the consensus tree of its cluster is minimum. So if this sounds familiar, that's because it is. We have a proposition that states that given a fixed clustering sigma, MCT actually decomposes into k independent SCT instances, meaning that we can rewrite the multiple consensus trees problem to simply find the clustering, because once we have the clustering, we already know what the consensus tree is given this proposition. So let's say, again, we look at this example solution space. Let's say we want to find consensus trees for k equals 3 clusters. This is how the solution space will be divided into 3 clusters. And on the right, you'll see each of the consensus tree for each of the clusters. Now the question becomes, how do we find sigma star? How do we find the optimal clustering? We look at methods and results. So in our paper, we prove that the multiple consensus trees problem is NP hard for general K. Therefore, we developed a mixed integer linear program seen here on the right. and there's a lot going on in this formulation, but let's just look at the 3 variables down there. We have x, y, and z. So variable x models the clustering, whereas variables y and z models the consensus trees. As you can see, x is a binary variable, which in linear programming, integer variables make the linear programming hard. And this makes sense because, like I said in the previous slides, we're only interested in knowing the clustering, because once we know the clustering, the consensus trees is given. So we want to be able to find out how our MLP performs on data. To do that, we use simulated data. We have small, medium, and large instances of simulated phylogeny inference solution spaces, and we ran the MLP within 1 hour using clusters, using k equals 1 to 5 clusters. And as you can see in this graph, it shows that for medium and large instances, as the number of clusters increases, the number of instances that is able to solve by the MLP decreases. So the MLP does not scale well with k and n. We then decided to use a heuristic, a coordinate ascent heuristic. This is similar to k-means, where we first find a random clustering sigma, and then we compute the consensus tree R for each cluster S. Then we reassign each tree to a cluster S, where the distance between that tree and the consensus tree of that cluster is minimum. Then we repeat until convergence. We then compare the performance of our MLP to our coordinate ascent. This is the same simulated instances that we saw earlier with small, medium, and large instances. We ran the MLP, and the column that is being shown by this arrow is the number of instances that is able to be solved by the MLP to provable optimality within 1 hour. On the column on the right is the number of instances where the heuristic return the MLP's optimal solution. And as you can see, the numbers are the same, meaning that for every instance where the MLP is able to solve the problem to optimality, the coordinate ascent is also able to solve it to optimality. And furthermore, the coordinate ascent only requires 100 restarts, which is within a few seconds, and this is a significant improvement to the MLP approach, which requires 1 hour. So I've talked about how we are able to find the clustering given K. I haven't talked about how we actually find K. So in order to do that, we use the Bayesian Information Criterion, and this is an example of another patient from the same article, New England Journal of Medicine article. This patient, patient 13, has 8 trees, and using the BIC method, we find that we only need one tree, one cluster to represent the solution space. On the other hand, this is the solution to patient 37, patient that we saw earlier, with 17 trees. Using the BIC method, it is seen that we require 2 clusters to represent the solution space. So why is that? Why are 2 trees necessary? So we do a similar analysis that we did with the parent-child graph, where we look at the combination of edges V1, V7, and V4, V10. Remember that these edges are mutually exclusive. They never occur in the same tree in the solution space. And as you can see, the consensus tree on the left represents the trees with edge V1, V7, whereas the consensus tree on the right represents the trees with edge V4, V10. We also are able to observe co-occurrence of edges. So in the tree on the left, we are able to see that V1, V7 tend to co-occur with V8, V5, whereas edges on the right-hand side, we are able to see that edges V4, V10 tend to co-occur with edges V4, V5. So multiple consensus trees are able to capture patterns of mutual exclusivity and co-occurrence. So as a conclusion, I introduced the multiple consensus trees problem. In our paper, we showed hardness and we presented a mixed integer linear program which didn't scale well with k and n. Then we also presented a efficient heuristic and showed that it finds optimal solutions. Finally, we have model selection for the number of clusters. In the future, we plan to relax the infinite sites assumption and also use alternative distance functions other than the parent-child distance. So I would like to thank the Al-Kabir group, especially my advisor, Muhammad Al-Kabir, and also my joint first author, Yunwen Chi. I also like to thank ISCB for the Travel Fellowship Award that enables me to attend this conference, and also these funding agencies that funded this project.
Okay, we have one question up here. Anyone else interested?
Thank you, very nice talk. I wonder, how do you know that your heuristic gives an optimal solution? Because for the ILP, you can use duality to establish optimality, but
yes.
The problem is non-convex. So how do you know your solution is optimal?
So we compare the mean distance that is returned by the MILP. If the coordinate ascent heuristic also returns the same value, then we consider it to find the same optimal solution as the MILP. Then we don't have a comparison for that. Yeah.
More questions, please. Okay, I have one question for you. What is a big problem instance in this case, and what is a small?
What is small?
Yeah, how do you do? I don't think you said what. How large a big problem instance is.
Yeah, so we separate the sizes of the problem instance for simulated data. So the small instances have about 6 to 10 trees, and then the medium instances about 11 to 45 trees, and then the large instances have more than that.
And do you have an idea about how large instances you really need to handle to be able to work with real problems in general? Or what's the next step in terms of applicability for your method?
So you're asking how big the real data gets?
Yeah.
So in this instance, we have the biggest instance is 17 trees for this cohort, but yeah, we haven't tried it with other cohorts yet, but that will be the next steps to also utilize it with cohorts with possibly larger instances than 17 trees. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank the speaker again.